Okay, few more points on agriculture and climate solutions, or reducing the impact of agriculture on climate by reducing emissions. And this is about creating sinks on working lands, not abandoned, degraded lands. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from land use and agriculture will have to play a central role in addressing climate change. After all, roughly a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions comes from this sector. But it turns out that our land use and agricultural practices can address climate change in other ways as well. In particular, we can create and enhance new sinks of carbon, especially carbon dioxide, but also for some methane on our working lands, especially managed forest, croplands and pastures. Such sinks can remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, gases that have already been emitted into the atmosphere. When does soil carbon accumulation slow down? So I'm jumping a little here, but there are some words of what the potential sinks are that I'm skipping. Soil carbon is very important. I really love this idea of enhancing soil carbon because it increases nutrient retention, soil moisture retention, drought resilience, soil health, crop yields and so on. Of course, also mitigate climate change. Given enough time, the carbon balance of a landscape comes to approximate equilibrium where carbon inputs are roughly balanced by carbon outputs. This is an unperturbed situation. Specifically, the carbon absorbed by photosynthesis is balanced by losses of carbon from decomposing plant matter and soil organic matter, and losses of soil organic carbon from erosion and leaching. And this equilibrium is reached, the levels of carbon in biomass, detritus and soils reflect this balance of carbon inputs and losses. Okay, so these carbon inputs and losses can approach equilibrium fairly quickly, but over the course of several years to a few decades, some forms of biomass in long-lived trees and soil organic carbon, especially semi-permanent organic matter tightly bound to soil particles, can continue to build up slowly, sometimes for centuries or more. That's real climate mitigation. It's not geologic time scale, but it's really good sequestration for a long time. This leads to the issue of saturation of carbon stocks on the landscape. While it is unlikely that any landscape has ever completely saturated their carbon stocks in biomass and soils, many asymptotically reach a saturated-like state in a few decades or less. That is, the buildup of carbon in biomass and soils is very rapid at first, for several years to a couple of decades, but then slowly, dramatically, slows dramatically as most of the biomass and soil carbon pools reach a near equilibrium state. Only the slow buildup of long-lived biomass, very large and old trees, and semi-permanent soil organic matter, a small fraction of the carbon in soils, will continue after this. Rather than saying that soils are saturated, which is technically correct, we prefer the term slowdown to denote this slowing in carbon accumulation on the landscape. There are other details: natural climate variability, droughts, wildfires, let's say warming or El Nino like situations. How do they affect all these things? So how long does it take to slow down? So years to soil carbon slow down, years to saturation. Here, for improved annual cropping practices, you have here this is in years, so years to saturation, so it's in the range, so this is a large range from about 20 to 50 or so. And you have cropland solutions, soil organic carbon, cover cropping, soil organic carbon, improved rice, trees and tree intercropping in biomass, agricultural biomass, tree intercropping in both biomass and soil organic carbon, grazing optimal intensity, grazing legumes in pasture, grazing solutions, managed grazing in soil carbon and biomass, silvopasture and silvopasture SOC and AGB. You get the idea. Sequester carbon. While a great many agricultural practices can sequester carbon, they differ in their ability to do so. Generally speaking, practices like agroforestry and perennial cropping systems that incorporate woody plants show higher sequestration rates per year. For example, here we are looking at range of reported sequestration rates and mean values. So again, this variation by climate in tons per hectare per year. I won't read all of that, but you will see abandoned farmland restoration, conservation agriculture in tropical humid places, conservation agriculture in boreal, temperate and boreal, semi-arid, and so on. Improved rice always shows up, and here you have some regenerative annual cropping in temperate to boreal humid climates, and tropical semi-arid, boreal and temperate semi-arid. Silvopasture has a huge impact in sequestration rates, and of course tree intercropping. So what are the big things here? Multi-strata agroforestry. I've discussed this in the Drawdown podcast series as well. So at least note those few big ones here. Abandoned farmland restoration, perennial staple crops. This is strata agroforestry, silvopasture and intercropping. Ranges of reported sequestration rates and mean values by climate types. You can look at humid, so similar details, but the numbers, you have to be careful of the scales. This is an order of magnitude larger, so obviously again, just remember the categories in which sequestration rate can be enhanced by, conservation agriculture or managed grazing, regenerative annual cropping, and so on and so forth. Okay, these are solutions which have measurable improvements in sequestration rates and soil carbons as well. Don't overlook agroforestry. Other than soil carbon, I'm also a massive fan of agroforestry. I have talked about it in many places. I was kind of marginally interested in it and looking at it and working with people who worked in agroforestry in the town I come from. Much of the attention on regenerative agriculture and carbon sequestration has revolved around improved annual cropping systems, managed cropping, and limited forms of crop livestock integration. But the potential benefits of agroforestry practices which integrate trees into working landscapes are often neglected. There are many issues in India. You have smallholders which have small land, acre or less, and as families separate, then the inheritance get divided again. So it's hard to convince people to put trees on tiny bits of land. So that's another challenge. Project Drawdown has found that these systems are already widespread, especially in the tropics. Many of the definitions of regenerative agriculture, including those used in certification systems and by some major food companies, minimize these powerful agroforestry practices. This is, I think, still considered a clean development mechanism, where if you do agroforestry at large enough scale and show that you are sequestering additional carbon that wouldn't be sequestered unless you did agroforestry, you can get paid for it. Okay, so that's a good way to motivate farmers to do it. And here is a coppiced edible leaf mulberry under nitrogen fixing acacia canopy. So it's a very nice example of agroforestry where you have plants mixed in with horticulture here, but you can do this for agriculture as well. It has a lot of advantages of reducing evaporative losses, increasing soil carbon, soil moisture holding capacities, drought resilience, post-rainy season incomes, and so on and so forth. Sequestering carbon requires nutrients and water. Organic matter, whether in living plants or soil compounds, is made from carbon and wide variety of other elements, the most limiting of which are nitrogen and phosphorus, the primary components of agricultural fertilizer. These elements are often extremely limited in many soils, especially degraded soils where soil carbon has already been lost. That means that carbon sequestration in biomass and soils may become limited by the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus on the landscape. For example, for every billion metric tons of CO2 that is sequestered, 25 million metric tons of nitrogen is required. Okay, essentially when you put fertilizers to grow crops and increase yields, you are doing temporary carbon sequestration because carbon is biomass, right? That's the equivalent of about 19% of global synthetic fertilizer production today. Water is of course of critical importance to photosynthesis, and water availability is projected to become ever more uncertain with climate change. Scarcity of water, nitrogen and other nutrients like phosphorus thus may constrain the size of agricultural carbon sinks to less than their technical potential. Here is a nice image of field stubble burning when the harvest is complete. So people use slash and burn kind of practices, but this is a massive problem in some places like northwest India. Okay, how long is this one? Maybe we can come back and continue with soil methane in the next one. This is already 11 minutes and I have about 10 more slides, so let's do another podcast to conclude maybe the report on farming our way out of climate crisis. That was the title of this report. Okay, you get the idea. So let's come back and meet for the last podcast in the next podcast.